Recording. Hey everyone, welcome back to Israel Matters, where we discuss the matters that matter to Israel at this complicated time in the world. How are you doing, Elliot?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
This is, of course, Elliot Chodoff. I'm sorry, this is Rabbi Wolicki. I'm Rabbi Pesach Wolicki. And of course, as always, my partner, Elliot Chodoff, is here with me. Before we get back to what's going on Israel's borders and what's going on with Israel's enemies in the region, I just wanted to share a thought from the weekly Torah portion that it occurred to me. And it's not really about anything specific that's said in the weekly Torah portion, but a theme that comes up. Our weekly Torah portion deals with the wicked sorcerer or prophet, whatever you want to call him, Bil'am, sometimes pronounced Bal'am in some of the translations in the book of Numbers, who is hired by Balak, who is the king of Moab, and he hires him in order to curse the people of Israel. He's afraid of the people of Israel and he wants them cursed. And of course, Bil'am has this experience where God takes over his mouth, so to speak, or essentially uses him as a tool, and instead of cursing Israel, he blesses Israel. And he blesses them multiple times. And it appears that the last blessing was not forced by God, but he finally blessed them willingly. But what I noticed as I was reading through it is that almost every time that Bil'am mentions the people of Israel, he mentions in his blessings of them, he calls the people of Israel Jacob, and he calls them Israel. So the most famous verse of that is where he says, "How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your tabernacles or your dwellings, Israel." And but he actually does this right from the very beginning of his blessings, and he does it over and over again. So for example, you have Balak leads me, the king of Moab, and he says, "Go curse Jacob for me, go censure Israel." That's in verse 7. And then he does it again, where he says in verse 10, "Who has counted the dust of Jacob or has tallied 1/4 of Israel?" He keeps referring to Jacob and Israel, Jacob and Israel. And the people of Israel, we don't think of them as being called Jacob, but the truth is that the people of Israel collectively are called Jacob sometimes in the Bible, and sometimes they're called Israel. And I just wanted to share one very, very short idea about that, because I've probably already gone on too long, which is that Jacob is the name that Jacob gets because he's following Esau. He's the second one out. He's following him on his heels. Esau also refers to Jacob's name as meaning kind of deception or kind of, being conniving. But that's what the name in Genesis first implies. So it's a name that implies some sort of secondary status. But the name Israel really implies sort of priesthood or ministry or princely nobility. That's what that name implies. And I think that what's going on here is that Bil'am saw the full scope of the impact of the people of Israel, of the Jewish people on the world. And he's the first person to ever mention the end times. He's talking about like what the long-term impact of Israel is. And that long-term impact really comes in two ways. It comes in the form of Jacob, that when the people of Israel are in exile, scattered, and even during all the centuries of our persecution, that's when we're Jacob. When we had a second place status, we were still having an impact on the world. But then there's the impact we have when we are Israel, when we are powerful and when we are noble and when we are in a position to wrestle, with the angel of Esau, and win. So I think that's still true today, that the people of Israel, our story throughout history, the story of Jacob, as it were, it has impact on the world, and we also have impact on the world when we're in a position of power, and that's so it's an interesting thing to watch, as everyone who's listening to this or watching this. When you read your Bible and you see the people of Israel being referred to as Jacob, like in Jeremiah chapter 17, where it refers to God redeeming Jacob from one mightier than he, that this is really talking about the people of Israel as we have survived throughout the centuries of exile. But thank God today we have returned to being Israel, to being a powerful nation that has impact on the world and can triumph. So yeah, that's my biblical thought for the week.
Thanks. Good one.
Thank you very much. So last week we were talking about Iran's recent behavior. Specifically, we were talking about an explosion that happened in Iran and how Iran was posturing and making statements about it. And because that was such a hot current events issue last week, we were talking about it. But let's bring this, if you could take us back to to where we were last time, and then
Sure.
and then maybe let's move into what exactly is Iran doing in Syria? What's their goal? What are their goals there? They don't want to topple the Syrian government, but they do want to operate there. And so, what exactly is their game? And of course, bringing it all back to what impact does this have on Israel?
Okay, well, first of all, there have been a number of explosions this week in other places in Iran.
Oh.
Yeah, Iran has been blowing up all over the place. Not attributed.
Have they been making statements? Have they been
No,
commenting?
there are accidents here and accidents there. And they may be. Some of them might very well be. I should, before we get into what's happening here in the region, I should also mention that one of the Iranian leaders this week said that many Americans, an Iranian leader said this, many Americans today have finally adopted our slogan, "Death to America."
Wow.
It's an interesting observation, comment.
Lines are being drawn in the world, and they're being drawn in such interesting ways. On the other hand, we also see that there was very publicly announced that the United Arab Emirates and Israel, medical researchers in those two countries are now openly cooperating on coronavirus research.
Right.
So you see, where who's an enemy and who's an ally is constantly shifting, and you see that in the streets of America.
Yes. Qatar is going in with Turkey now. You know what? Before we go into the Syrian story from the Iranian move, I think it pays to relate it to something you just said in a more theoretical sense. We look upon these shifts, yesterday's friends, today's enemies, tomorrow perhaps friends again. We look at it in the context of the world that most of us grew up in, which was the Cold War. And even those who are younger, we're post-Cold War, but the Cold War has an impact. The whole field of international relations developed during the Cold War. In other words, there's a model context. And the fact is, the 50 years of the Cold War were very unusual in terms of international relations in human history.
I mean, in the sense that there were just two camps.
Well, it was not just that it was two camps. That's part of it. It was a bipolar world, but it was also a very stable world. Now, when I say stable, I mean politically stable, not that it certainly had its moments. There was that Cuba thing back in '62, and there were conflicts. There were many conflicts. But there was a political stability in the sense that you woke up in the morning and you pretty much knew who your team was and who their team was, because it was the exact same team that it's been for years, and it's not going to change very much. In the entire period, there was only one major country that voluntarily changed sides. Egypt in the 1970s went from the Soviet to the American orbit. But other than conquests, no major country woke up one morning and said, okay, yesterday I was there, today I'm going somewhere else. And that's stability. The lines were drawn and they stayed that way. That's not typical. What we're seeing today is much more typical diplomacy, international relations that's gone on through history. Let's not forget the Germans and the Russians signed the Non-Aggression Pact in 1939. When the Kaiser declared war in 1914, he was convinced that Britain would remain neutral because Britain doesn't fight alongside France. Germany and Britain defeated France 100 years earlier under Napoleon.
Right, and the U.S. in that conflict did remain neutral until pretty late.
Right. No, but I'm right. Very late. All I'm saying is that this idea of a stable diplomatic world with no shifts and no behind the scenes and no short-term dealings because it works for me today and it may not work for me tomorrow, that's standard. There's a great story, maybe apocryphal, but it's a great story anyway, that they woke up the great Austrian statesman von Metternich in the middle of the night and told him the Russian ambassador has dropped dead. And he said, I wonder what his motive could have been. That's the way the world really works, and that 50 years of the Cold War was actually an anomaly. So on the one hand, which is why, by the way, and I've discussed this in lectures, when the Russians and the Turks were working together, everyone was saying, oh, look, the Turks and the Russians are developing this long-term relationship. And it's like, no, Turkey and Russia have been adversaries for centuries. This is a short-term agreement of convenience, and it'll fall apart in its own right. And the Turks are using it for their benefit, the Russians for their benefit, and so on and so forth.
Right.
And the Americans are trying to...
what you're saying also helps frame something you talked about in 2 episodes ago. For those of you who haven't seen it, go back and watch that one, our discussion of Russia, that like the idea, the relationship that, let's say, Israel has to Russia. Like, so Russia is an ally of Assad, but they're also kind of an ally of Israel, and they're kind of not, meaning the gray areas in these relationships are things that were inconceivable in a Cold War configuration.
Right, and I wouldn't even use the word ally in either of those.
Right. It doesn't have meaning.
Ally is too high a status.
Right. In fact, it's almost a Cold War concept. Like, oh,
right, exactly.
We're in this camp or in that camp.
Precisely.
Well, this itself is by the way, Elliot, this itself, even if it's a tangent, this is a very interesting, conversation, and it's not the kind of thing people get on the news. Like, this is in terms of framing what we're seeing when we see the news.
Right, and that leads us to the Iran and Syria point, because we have to realize that Iran is not a natural ally of Syria for a number of reasons. First of all, and this is also something that's largely missed in analysis, the Iranians are not Arabs, they're Persians. Just like the Turks are not Arabs, they're Turks. Arab is an ethnic definition based on language. An Arab is a native speaker of Arabic. The Arab world is the world of native Arabic speakers that goes from Iraq to Morocco, and without breaking it down, just that belt. And the Persians are outsiders. The Persians and the Arabs have been in conflict for forever, basically. So it's not a natural alliance in the sense of, let's say, the English-speaking world has a sort of natural affinity.
Canada, England, U.S.,
Australia.
Right.
It's an affinity. It doesn't guarantee, but there's an affinity. Here we're talking about 2 different peoples, Arabs and Persians, who have a natural conflict that's gone on for a very long time. The second part of it, and also one that's largely missed and glossed, is the idea that the Iranians are supporting the Assad regime because the Assads are Alawites. The Alawites broke away from the Shiites. And again, we don't have to go into the history of the religious split. And since they're so near to each other religiously, it's a natural alliance between the Shiites and the Alawites. Now, if you say that really fast and don't think about it, it seems to make sense. The only problem with it is that it flies in the face of all understanding of conflict that's ever been written. You don't need to be a great, knowledgeable historian to know that when one sect breaks away from another, the relationship between them is not friendship. See note, Reformation in Europe.
Right.
But but even if it's not on a national conflict level, even within denominations, and here we can go Jewish, Christian, it doesn't really matter. When a group splinters off a denomination, usually the relationship, the reason for the split is a conflict. It could be theological, it could be political, it could be personal, it doesn't really matter. But the reason for the split is a conflict, and that conflict intensifies as a result of the split. So in fact, all understanding of how religious division works means that the Shiites and the Alawites are natural enemies. Despite all of the above, Iran is helping the Assad regime. And there are a number of reasons for that. It allows, the primary one is that it permits the Iranians to operate relatively freely in Syria. Now, Syria is critically important, and here again, I'm going to digress into background, and this may take the rest of the talk, but it's worth it because it's important to understand where this is coming.
And then we'll just pick it up next week. I think we want to go in depth here. That's what we want.
Okay, so the region that we're in, the Middle East, is arguably the most important strategic region in the world from global imperial power perspectives. And I won't get into the debate whether others, this is a very important region. And it's important geographically for two reasons. There's the obvious and the less obvious. The obvious one is for anybody who played Risk, you know that the Middle East, or just look at a map, is the crossroads of three continents. Africa, Asia, and Europe, this is the hub. More importantly, from a global power perspective, this is also a bridge between oceans. And I say that, and it pains me to say it as a ground forces officer, global power is projected by sea, not by land. And in other words, navies. And this is a region, and we can use Israel as a very good example. This tiny little country has ports on the Mediterranean that go out to the Atlantic and a port in Eilat that goes out to the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. And they're driving time 2 hours away from each other. I mean, America has ports on the Atlantic and Pacific, but they're 3,000 miles away from each other.
Right.
So now the Suez Canal makes it really obvious. By the way, I don't know if you know this, but in ancient times there was a Suez Canal.
Really?
Yes, it wasn't the Suez Canal as we know it today, but a canal was cut from the Nile to the Gulf of Suez. So ships could actually go from the Mediterranean via the Nile. Remember, we're talking about much smaller ships in those days, and through the canal and out through the Red Sea. In other words, even back then, before satellites and GPS and all of that, people knew how to travel. And this zone, the Middle East, has been a central imperial zone for about, 4,000 years?
Wow.
Right, if you think about it. Now, by saying 4,000 years, I've essentially transcended two very important categories of discussion. The first is technology. In other words, anything that's been a constant or a relative constant for 4,000 years is not technology based. Right? The technology of this, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
When we say technology, we don't mean something that's been around for 4,000 years, right?
Right. I mean, by the way, let's keep in mind, we sit today and say, wow, we're in a whole new era of technology. Every generation since Adam has said that. Right. We've got a wheel now. Nobody can stop us. Right? Every generation comes up with something new, and there's change. And every generation says, "Wow, now we've gotten it. We've hit the peak." But again, if you go back, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Romans, I'm just throwing a number of them out. We're all in different technological periods, as were the Turks, as were the Brits, as is the world today, and each one finds its way back into the Middle East because of this ocean bridge. Now, virtually every empire that was either homegrown or came from the outside tried to get a foothold on those two bodies of water. Okay, so here's the sort of the kicker. Turkey wants to get to the Persian Gulf. Iran wants to get to the Mediterranean.
Wow.
And Iran's operations in Syria, in large part, not exclusively because some of it has to do with us, but in large part has to do with maintaining a land bridge between Iran and their naval bases in Syria that were set up with the permission of the Syrian government that are on the Mediterranean coast. Why the Mediterranean? Because from there out to the Atlantic, they say they want to be in the Caribbean. They have an ally in Venezuela. In other words, they're thinking.
And is this because of military aspirations or because of economic gain?
The two are intertwined. If they're going to have relations with Venezuela, they need to be able to ensure them with power. If they want to engage the United States, they want to be able to engage the United States in the Atlantic, not just in the Persian Gulf.
Okay, so to sum up just kind of, it seems like we're setting the table for a much deeper understanding
Yes.
of Iran's activity, but the most basic, I guess, fact or rule that we should remember when we're understanding the dynamics of what's going on in Syria with all these different actors is what everybody's motivation is to be there. And you're saying that Iran's primary motivation for its operations in Syria and its leveraging of its power there with the Syrian regime has directly to do with getting all the way across to the Mediterranean.
Yes.
So are they operating ports that come out on the Mediterranean from Syrian territory or from Lebanese territory?
No, Syrian territory. As are the Russians, by the way, for the same reason.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a pure strategic reason for their operating there. Now we can add others. We can add to the fact that it serves Iran's defense purposes to have very weak regimes in Iraq and Syria. Okay, you don't want strong neighbors who can wake up one morning like Saddam Hussein did and decide to invade you. Mm-hmm. People forget.
You want vassals. You want, meaning the relationship that they have with Lebanon through their through Hezbollah, essentially the Iranian party in Lebanon that has such a great percentage of the power in that country. That's the ideal situation for them. And even though they're not going to achieve that level of control in Syria, if they can have some leverage that they're holding over the Syrians, maybe this is we can't go much further than this today. But I think maybe next week we should pick up at some as we understand what Iran is doing in Syria and what their motives are. We have to understand what the relationship between them and the Russians is, in terms of to what extent it's love and to what extent it's hate, and to what are they at odds with each other, or are they working together, or is it a little bit of both? These are the kinds of things we'd like to understand as we take further look at these dynamics. Again, Elliot, I think that's all we have time for today.
Okay.
So let's
actually,
if you could just wrap us up now.
Yeah. Okay. Just first of all, to relate to what you just said, I think that the Iran-Russian relationship is classic mutual use abuse. And what I would rather do next time is to cycle back into Iran versus Israel, because what Iran wants to do in Syria has an Israel component that's partly strategic, but it's much deeper than that. And the much deeper part, I think, is where we need to start next time, because the Iranian, in contrast to everything I said earlier, the Iranian relationship to Israel, the enmity, the hatred, is a constant, and it's not based on politics.
and it's not a cover for something else. It's real.
Yeah.
You know, that's interesting, because sometimes ideology, as shrewd as these chess players are, if you know, sometimes their ideology can get away, can get in the way of them making shrewd.
It establishes their objectives, and they can still play strategically.
Uh-huh.
But you know what? Let's leave that for next time.
We'll leave that for next time. That's awesome. All right, thanks a lot, Elliot, and
Thank you.
to everyone. Have a wonderful Shabbat, have a wonderful week, and let's remember to keep praying for what matters to Israel most. God bless.